Everyone. Welcome to our very first event for this year of the Council of the Association of Professional Bankers, Continuous Professional Development, Demystifying Domestic Debt Restructuring. To start off the proceedings, I will now call for the APB anthem to be played, after which will be followed by the welcome and opening address by Mr. B.H.S. Preena, President of APB. I wish may have the music on, and I would all invite you to rise for the anthem. Thank you.
Empowering professionals, we are committed. Since 1988, we stand united. Our loyalty is with integrity to what is best for our community. We are the members of the APB,
serving all who are in our society.
be they wealthy, be they meek,
What's best for them we'll seek.
standing firm for all that we should be. We do what's good for banking governance. Learn the rules and give them prominence. Let's make sure of what is truly right. They will be the trusted line. We are the members of the APB, serving all who are in our society.
Onwards to the future.
We do ascend with challenges and tests. We shall contend by building on the strengths we uphold. With bankers' ethics, we'll be bold. Empowering professionals, we are committed. Since 1988, we stand united. We stand united.
Thank you, and you may resume your seats. To empower banking professionals, I invite Mr. B.H.S. Preena, President APB Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Jiranti. Good evening. Very warm welcome to all of you, including our distinguished panel today, Mr. Mushin, Deputy Chairman, Commercial Bank of Ceylon, then Mr. Bingumal Tevaratantri, CEO, Standard Chartered Bank, then Mr. Dumindu Hulangamua, Partner, ENY, then our moderator of our very own, Mr. Dishan Rodrigo, Chief Operating Officer of Hatton National Bank. As all of us know, our country had been going through a series of challenges during the last few years. It is in political, economic, and social fronts. So that's why now it has come to a stage where the debt restructuring is being very extensively discussed. Then the foreign component or the ISBs, there had been some talks going on. Then also now it has come to the domestic debt restructuring. So since all the stakeholders are eagerly awaiting the outcome of this. We thought it's the best topic to start our new season, that is under the new council. This is the first seminar under the Continuous Professional Development Committee. So we thought this is the best way to start our season. So that's why we thought of this topic, demystifying domestic debt restructuring. So we have an eminent panel today to share their knowledge and views on this topic. So therefore, I will not dwell upon that topic anymore. So the record turnout today, I think amply demonstrates the importance of the discussion going to take place today. In fact, this can have only about 250, but we had registration for over 300. So that shows how keen our banking community to know the latest update on DDR, or now it's called DDO. So this is the first event, as I mentioned, under the CPDC committee. So I need to congratulate Chiranti and the CPDC team for the splendid job done in meticulously planning this and presenting this event. Also, my thanks to my colleagues in the council and advisory council members and all those who supported us. Special thanks to Rohana and Manjula, our council members from Bank of Ceylon, for arranging this auditorium and the logistical arrangements. So we are planning to present many more seminars like this in the coming year and going forward. Just to talk about APB, for who I think those who are who doesn't know much, APB, as mentioned in our anthem also, was formed in 1988 by a group of eminent bankers at that time, senior bankers led by Mr. Rianzi Vijayatilaka, who was the former HNB managing director, and he was the first president of APB back in 1988. Then that council had very senior bankers like Mr. Sivagananathan, Mr. Kadiraveru Pillai, and Mr. Ernest Gunasekara, bankers of that caliber. So the main objective of APB is to promote and facilitate studies in the field of banking, and also organize knowledge sharing sessions like this and training for the professional bankers, and also promote and safeguard common interest of the profession and promoting fellowship among members. So at the moment we have about a membership of over 2,600. From CEOs to the junior executive levels, we have a very broad-based membership. In addition to the CPDC, we are having our activities under various other committees. We have a publication committee, then we have a membership and social committee, then also we have a special events committee. So a lot of activities we do, like publications, e-journals, then also having CSR projects. Then for membership, we have Members Day, then we have sports events or maybe talent contests, debates, then quiz programs, things like that. So the flagship event of the APB is the annual convention, which we hold in February. Last year we had in February. So this year also in 24, we are planning to have our annual convention, which will be with the blessings of the Central Bank Governor. He will be the chief guest. And I kindly invite all APB members to actively take part in these activities, as well as those who have not obtained membership but are eligible to do so and join APB. So if you want more details, you can contact our APB Secretariat. It's located in the OPA building in Stanley Vijayasundara. And also there are bank coordinators appointed for all the banks, and we have council members also. So all the banks are represented. You can talk to your bank coordinator and get more details and obtain the membership. So without much ado, I now invite Chiranti to proceed with the discussion today and to introduce the keynote speaker and the panelists. So I wish you all a pleasant evening. Hope you will enjoy this session. Do not hesitate to clarify any doubts you have on this topic, because at the end of the keynote speaker's address, there will be a panel discussion followed by a open forum. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is my honor and privilege to introduce this eminent panel of speakers. I will start with Mr. Shahan Mujin, Chairman and Board Director. Shahan Mujin is a proven and trusted board and C-level leader with in-depth interactions with chairpersons, boards of directors, CEOs, and senior management teams in strategic dialogue in relation to major corporate actions. Extensive experience working with leading global institutions, multinational and local corporations, governments, sovereign wealth funds, and private equity firms across Asia Pacific. Shahan previously worked in best-in-class global investment banks, Credit Suisse, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and JP Morgan in leading regional coverage roles. His most immediate role was as Managing Director, Head of Southeast Asia Financial Institutions Group, FIG, Head of Asia Insurance, and Country Manager Sri Lanka, based in Singapore. The Asia FIG Sectors team had won the FIG Asia House of the Year Award and Best Sri Lanka Investment Bank from the Asset Magazine and Finance Asia Magazine for various years under his leadership. Multiple transactions he led have been awarded as Best Country Deals with Best Financial Sector Capital Raise Transactions. Shahan has experience at the policy level working as a team leader at the National Council for Economic Development under the Ministry of Finance. Shahan holds a Master's in Economics from the University of Colombo, a Bachelor of Business Administration honors from the Western Michigan University. He has completed corporate finance training from JP Morgan in New York and directorship program at the Singapore Management University. The current positions he include are Chairman Platinum Advisors, Deputy Chairman Commercial Bank of Ceylon PLC, Director David Perry's Holdings Private Limited, Director Lanka Angel Network Private Limited, Director H201 Private Limited, Chairman CBC Finance, Deputy Chairman Amana Takaful Life PLC, Director PCCW Hong Kong Private Limited, Director Gestetner of Ceylon PLC. I will introduce the other speakers as well before I invite Sharan to the podium. We have Mr. Duminda Hulangamua, Partner Ernst & Young, Tax Market Service Line, Ernst & Young, Sri Lanka and Maldives. Duminda joined EY in 1984 and has been a partner since 1991 and currently functions as the TMSL for Sri Lanka and the Maldives since 2012. He specializes in both direct and indirect taxes, and his experience covers many diversified areas of business. During this period, he was instrumental in setting up the transpricing ITTS and BTA sub-service lines. Duminda also functions as a vice chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, which is the largest and oldest trade chamber in Sri Lanka, dating back almost 175 years. Duminda also actively contributes to the government on formulation of national tax policy and implementation. He is a fellow member of the Chartered Institute of Accountants Sri Lanka, a fellow member of the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants SEMA UK, and a graduate in law from the University of London. I am now pleased to introduce Pingumal Thevaratantri, FCMA CGMA Chief Executive Officer, Sri Lanka, Head of CCIB Client Coverage for Standard Chartered Bank. Bingumal, better known as Bingu, was appointed the CEO of Standard Chartered on 1st January 2019. He is the first Sri Lankan national to be appointed to the position. Apart from his role as CEO, Bingu also heads Sri Lanka's commercial, corporate and institutional banking business. Having joined Standard Chartered in July 2004, Bingu counts for more than 25 years of experience within the banking and finance industry. During his tenure at Standard Chartered, he has held several leadership positions in Sri Lanka and Africa, including the role of head transaction banking in Mauritius, where he was responsible for setting up the transaction banking business for the franchise. Bingu was elected as a board member of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce for 2021 and 22 and also serves as the chairman of Sri Lanka's Banks Association. He holds an MBA from the University of Wales. Further, Bingu Mal is also FCMA, a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants and a Chartered Global Management Accountant of the Institute of Management Accountants, CIMA, USA. And now, last but not least, it is my bounden pleasure to invite Mr. Dilshan Rodrigo, Executive Director and Chief Operating Officer of Hatton National Bank PLC and also my colleague. Dilshan possesses over 2 decades of banking experience and is the Executive Director and COO of HNB PLC. He provides leadership to finance, credit, operations, risk management, banking services compliance, internal audit, and ITD functions. He is overseeing the cross-functional teams involved in improving governance and compliance, serving in several board and management committees in the bank. Dilshan is an MBA from Cranfield University, UK. He is a fellow member of the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants and a fellow of ACCA UK. Dilshan has played a catalyst role in transformation of the bank and is an industry steward for reforms and change. Dilshan also holds many serious senior positions. I'm not going to read Dilshan's profile because he has given me express permission, not that the others didn't. I am at liberty to take shortcuts being colleagues at work. Ladies, gentlemen, and everyone present here today, we are in the presence of many years of experience, presumably over 100 years of experience among our panelists, and probably thousands of years of experience in this room. It is a very overwhelming assembly of bankers in this August auditorium of Bank of Ceylon this evening. So I will now welcome Sharan to the podium to have us indulge with his keynote address. Thank you.
Thank you for the introductions. Very good evening to distinguished guests here, the President and Council members of the APB, as well as ladies and gentlemen. This is a critical element in Sri Lanka's future that we are currently discussing, and I'm privileged to have the opportunity to share with you some thoughts that I have on this topic. I know we have all been following this quite closely because it's quite central to the performance of the financial institutions that we are working in, as well as the broader economy. So this is something that we all need to understand. It's very important for us to understand. The title says Demystify, which basically means to clarify. So I will try to keep it a little bit more pointed and more direct to the core of the heart of the problem. So I'll start essentially covering three areas. I'll just recap what has happened with the domestic debt restructuring to date, the progress and where we are. Then I'll give an overview of the Sri Lanka's position, which we have heard from various commentators, most extensively from the IMF March DSA, and finally spend some time on some of the key challenges or considerations for the DDO, as we now call it, and then we can get into the panel and discuss more broadly on some of the other aspects. Firstly, the domestic debt restructuring. So the domestic debt restructuring is really a process undertaken to re-establish debt sustainability. There is a bit of debate whether that is after you take into consideration external debt restructuring or before that. So the sequencing of that is very relevant, but essentially you get into a debt restructuring when the debt is not sustainable, and then do you get into a domestic debt restructuring when the external debt restructuring, EDR we would call it, is not sufficient to get you back to the debt sustainability path. So those are some of the discussion points we have. Whether it's optimization or restructuring, well, we can all agree that optimization is a better phrase, and the central bank has chosen that, so we can proceed with that in terms of just expediency. So the whole purpose of the debt sustainability analysis is to get to a sustainable level of gross financing needs. So I'll spend a bit of time on that before we get in a little bit deeper. So gross financing needs is essentially, there's two components to it, the primary deficit and the debt service. The primary deficit is, you can consider it something similar to an operating income, right? The country's operating profitability level. So that's essentially income less expenditure before you take into considerations any maturing debt or interest service. So that is a core component. We all lend to corporates as bankers, and we look at EBITDA, we look at operational profitability, and if there isn't operational profitability, then the viability of that institution is in question. So it's a very simple way of looking at it. So when you look at that, the primary deficit, we need to take into consideration the GDP growth, the taxation policy, the fiscal approach, the way the government is managing on the expenditure side. So there are various elements that play into that. And of course, the government takes central responsibility in managing that, but obviously affected quite a lot by other external elements. Then the debt service is, of course, the debt stock that you carry forward as well as the maturing debt. So these two together give you what we call the gross financing needs. So the entire purpose of the DSA is to get the gross financing needs to a manageable level. Even if you have a large debt stock, if your gross financing needs is within your cash flow capability, let's call it, then you are on a manageable trajectory. And this entire exercise is derived to try and achieve that. So how can we get to DDR, DDO? How can we get to that? There are three principal ways. The first one is the face value reduction. And some of you have heard of this. We call it the haircut. And then, everywhere we go around, we discuss what is the extent of the haircut. Then the other one is the maturity extension, which is the reprofiling. Some of the economists in the country have talked about that extensively, that a reprofiling is needed. And that really affects the net present value. So the discount rate is the key element in thinking about the maturity extension. Finally, the coupon adjustment. The coupon adjustment is a smaller level. The saving you get or the impact on the DSA is much more limited, but it's also a helpful tool because it reduces again the immediate net financing needs. So I have put some ticks here. In the Sri Lankan case, in our case, we have looked at the external debt, only the external debt for the face value reduction. And that has been the communication, and I'll speak a little bit more as we go through. The central bank has given various guidance. The IMF in their communication has given various guidance, and some of the parliamentarians and the president's office has also issued some level of guidance in terms of the thinking on the strategy. So then I'll come to the next section, which is the current state of play. Where are we today? Right. So this is quite important. This is our starting point. So if we look at the end of 2022, our debt to GDP is at a clearly unsustainable level of 128%. And our gross financing needs are at about 34% of GDP. Now, what the IMF does is they give us targets. They have given us 4 targets. And they say, look, you tell us how you're going to achieve it. But those are the targets you need to achieve. The path to achieve targets, they give us a scenario. But that is one of many scenarios we can choose from. So we have, and I think various institutions have tried to develop alternate scenarios. So we can speak a little bit about the alternate scenarios. The government can also have its own scenario. But the well-published scenario is the IMF scenario, so we'll spend a little bit of time on that. But the essence is the IMF targets. The IMF targets, there's 2 key targets. One is to get the debt stock, debt to GDP down to 95%. So that is by 2032. Now, this is on a gradually declining plane. So they have obviously targets for each year, but the objective is get to 95%. The second one is the gross financing needs. For that to drop to 13% of GDP. Now, the gross financing needs has also this interesting element of where can you raise financing. The Sri Lankan government was able to access international capital markets, which was cause of the problem. But that also helps the gross financing needs. So the access to the bond markets, access to the banking market, which will spend a bit more time, are also elements of that. So there are also 2 other aspects, which is the FX debt service ratio and the refinancing gap. But the 2 key ones, I would say, is the 95% debt to GDP target and the gross financing needs. Now, what we need to do collectively is map a path to that. That is the quickest we get there with the least impact on society. So that's been really the challenge. Then just to recap, now from the time we had a preemptive default, which is what we called it in April 2022, it has taken us almost 12 months to come to the first IMF debt sustainability analysis, right, which happened in March, so about 11 months. So that is also not final, but that gives us now the macroeconomic framework, which is what we really need to so that we can get our planning proper. Then subsequent to that, there was a communication on 30th March that the DDO will be done on a voluntary basis. Now, this word voluntary has many connotations, and that's, it has been applied in different countries in different ways. So we can discuss a little bit more about what that actually means. The president also in the parliament added to the debate by saying that a DDO is essential and parties should be open to that. And then, of course, lastly, there was a IMF press conference on the 23rd, which was their exit conference when their team was leaving. So there's always been in between, we had the Bankers Association writing in response to some of the public commentary, rebutting some of the points. So the discussion is quite active, but just to bring everybody up to speed. Now, when we talk about what is the path to the DSA and the path to the domestic debt optimization, we will take pointers from the communication because those are relevant in the context of what we're trying to do. So firstly, I will deal with the primary balance. So this is quite critical because you have to get our home in order. That's what this is, right? So you have to first get our operating base straight. So we have been running a primary deficit for the last 4 years. So which basically means we've been spending money we didn't have, and we all knew that. But it's just helpful to keep that in perspective. The first thing we are trying to do is by 2024, we want it to turn positive. So our revenue will exceed our expenditure. And by 23, we get to 2.3% of GDP. There is a view in the market among some economists that might be a bit too ambitious to get to, right? But that is the sort of framework that is now delivering, according to the IMF scenario, the 95%. So if you look at the 2022 performance, the IMF primary balance target at that time was -4%. But the government outperformed and managed to come inside of the target, which is a positive indicator. But the entire primary balance is largely driven by revenue consolidation, and that's why the tax impact has hit everyone. So you can see the growth in the tax component is what's driving this. Any pullback in the tax component needs to be compensated with some other way. Now, this is, as I said, there are different scenarios. This is the scenario that has been put forward by the IMF, and that is the scenario that has been used for the debt sustainability analysis, and it's up to us to develop a better scenario if one is available. So the key here is the primary balance is really critical in the subsequent years. The debt restructuring is going to take care of 23, 24. But it is subsequent to that, it's the primary balance that is going to support the debt sustainability going forward. So it's a very important thing too. We will get over the debt restructuring with some difficulty. But once we do that, then we need to put ourselves on a proper path for growth. Then in terms of the debt stock, right? So there is an intention. Again, I'm now looking at the IMF scenario, right? And the IMF scenario is very close to the central bank scenario, which maybe is a little bit more optimistic than the IMF scenario. So IMF scenario envisages that the public debt to GDP will reduce from 128 to 111 and 108, 23, 24, supported by debt restructuring, and the remaining improvements are now coming off the primary deficit. That's the point that I wanted to drive there. So if you look at the 2023 column, which is what we're going to do this year in terms of achieving these plans, there is a big contribution from the residual. The residual is the residual debt. So we have to reduce that to achieve this particular objective. But ultimately, it is that 2032 objective we are after, 95% debt to GDP. And there's also movements in interest rates, inflation that affect it, particularly this year because we are in that transitionary stage where interest rates are moving down rapidly, and the central bank and the IMF have taken a view that it will move down sharply. Now, there may be differences in that, but that also flows through. In the 2023 period, the single element is how deep are we going to take down the debt stock. And then subsequently, you can see the contributory elements, how the primary balance, the automatic debt dynamics, which are largely the interest rates and inflation, and other identified flows are if we get any other support from other multilateral agencies, etc. So that gives you, in some ways, the framework that we are working on. Now, I will now jump into a little bit more into the actual debt restructuring. Today, we are going to focus a bit more on the domestic debt, but to keep it in context, it's helpful to understand the foreign debt side of things also. So if you look at our total debt stock, it's about 83 billion. About 39 billion is in the foreign stock is about 45 billion. And out of that, they have identified that it is 39 9 billion that they will treat. Now that has been said officially. So there are things that are sort of more or less facts and given, and there are things that are up for discussion. So at the moment they have said, and when I say they, I'm talking about the central bank and the IMF, that certain types of foreign debt will not be dealt with. The multilateral creditors, emergency assistance, bilateral, and there's reasons for that. Some of them are at very low rates, and they are on very extended periods. There is no benefit to trying to deal with that. So it's the private creditors and the official bilateral creditors that we deal with. So in that, you would have the international bondholders. In the private creditor bucket, you have 20 billion and 10 billion in the bilateral. The challenge has been in the past to get here was really on the bilateral side. The G2G discussions took a little bit longer than they planned, and that is not only a local thing, it's a global thing. So these challenges we are getting, we have, I would say, more exaggerated issues because of maybe lack of fiscal discipline in the past, but in other countries also COVID-related primary deficits were quite high. So they were also running into, a lot of other countries were running into a problem, and that's where we have multiple restructurings going on. What they have said is that for the external private debt, there would be a principal reduction, which is a haircut. And they have also commented on the amortization period. They have not commented on the quantum, right? And for the bilateral creditors, they have said there will be a maturity extension, a reprofiling. So those are the type of negotiations that they have made some progress on. Then we come to the domestic debt. Now, one thing we need to keep in perspective as far as the domestic debt goes is that what led us all here, right? So when the banking risk framework was set up, and I want to spend 2 minutes on this because it's important, is that the way it was set up was the government was supposed to be risk-free, right? So in a way, there was an implicit encouragement, or I would say a lack of inhibition for banks, financial institutions, other players to invest in treasury bills, government securities. Why? Because there is no risk weighting. So, and then on top of that, there is no exposure limits. And then here we had a very attractive return. So these three put together, lack of risk weightings and lack of exposure limit, you can take your balance sheet up to 50-60% in government securities. There is no limit. Now, no other risk category in the financial services is you are allowed to do that. And every other risk category has a risk weight. So stopping you from doing that. So these didn't, so this, the risk framework did not stop us from doing, concentrating too much on the sovereign risk. Now, this is a matter that has been discussed in Washington. It's not unique to us. The nexus between the sovereign and the financial sector is very deep and has got deeper. And in some ways, there are positive aspects to it. If the government wants to drive a development agenda, social welfare agenda, access to the banking system, you can argue it's helpful. But of course, if it is not used in a productive way. So there is a debate going on, how do you address this risk from re-emerging? So given this background, the banks, when given an opportunity to allocate risk, took central bank risk as a risk-free tool that generated a very good return. So this is where the complexity, and it's not again unique to us, it's across the globe. That nexus between the sovereign, and still there is some debate on how do you solve this from happening a second time, right? But anyway, that's a broad, separate discussion. So what do we have today? We have a significant concentration in T-bills and T-bonds. Again, what the central bank has said is that they will only treat the T-bills held by the central bank. Of course, there was a big cheer in the market after that happened, and people started buying treasury bills, which is, of course, doesn't help because now the exposure is getting weighed very heavily on the treasury bill side. So the debt sustainability, if we continue to buy a lot of treasury bills, it'll have to be relooked because it comes down to debt servicing. Then second, it said a select pool of domestic debt is assumed to be reprofiled. Now, what do they mean by select pool? Again, there were several communication. There were reference to a category of banks, a category of pension funds, etc. But there was no clear guidance, and it was defined as voluntary. Now, in other countries, in Ghana, the voluntary was, not really voluntary. If you didn't take the voluntary, you'd be in a serious risk, and no board could, given the risks, justify not taking it. So the only way you don't take it is if you have shorter tenor and you think the recovery is fairly quick and your exposure is quite limited. But one of the things they do is if the central bank says you cannot come to our window again, which is some of the rules that they try to introduce, it then sort of, it's a very strong incentive. So the ability for the central bank to put incentives and disincentives on various segments of creditors is a critical factor in how they will select. Then I come to, crucial side here. I have taken the liberty of making some assumptions. I must state very clearly all the views that I'm giving are my personal views and not the views of commercial bank. So I just want to be clear about that. And again, I've been trying to be very clear about what the central bank has said and what we are speculating a little bit. So the number of total debt is 84 billion, right? And we think the number that needs to be restructured is 17 or 18 billion, and that's roughly in line with what the other commentators are saying. So there's a high level of comfort. That's the number that we need to get to, right? Now that is on. Now we are holding the primary deficit, the gross financing needs, all of that onto that scenario that the IMF has mapped. But let's assume that we are trying to achieve that objective. So then it's 17 billion, and then we break it into two buckets: the ERD and the DDO. In the central bank, when they classified the DDO, they classified the DDO specific to the banks, and the restructuring to the T-bills of the central bank. So let me deal with the foreign one first, right? So as I mentioned earlier, they are going to deal with 10.6 billion of bilateral credit and 20.3 billion of private creditors. And now the haircut, right? So that is assumed to be, now there's no number, right? All the banks have provided to some extent in preparation for that and have tried to get themselves ready, but there's no specific number out there, and I've used 30 to 35%. You have global precedent, it can go up to 40%, and it can go down as well. So if you use the higher end of that, then you're looking at about 10 billion of that 17 billion coming through the foreign side. Of course, the thing to remember is the foreign side is not entirely foreign, because the foreign is also local. The local banks are holding quite a bit of ISPs, right? So there is an impact to the domestic system through that. Then then that leaves us, and I'm using numbers just to give an illustration. So the actual numbers may vary, but this hopefully is a fair enough approximation. So if you use then you're left with 7 billion, and then out of the T-bills, and I'm using US dollar billion figures here, about 7 billion is held by the central bank. And the central bank has already said we are going to reprofile them. So depending on how you treat them, then of course, the remaining ones are the ones that come to the T-bonds, right? So if you, and I'll just throw some scenarios out, right? So if you assume you treat the treasury bills held by the CBSL. Now there are certain issues with regards to the CBSL balance sheet, but that is a manageable to a large extent. So if you take a 35% haircut on the T-bills, then it's about a 4.5 billion hit to the central bank, which leaves roughly a 3 to 4 billion US hit on the bonds. Now we are talking about that number against a total bond holding of 24 billion. So you can get a sense. Right? The one other comment I will make is now the total bilateral credit is 30 billion. If you take an additional 10% haircut on the foreign, not the bilateral, the total foreign currency debt is 30 billion that we have already said we are going to deal with. If you take an additional 10% haircut on that, that is then roughly equivalent to the ask on the bondholders outside, on the bondholders locally. Just to give you a context of the levers that the IMF and the central bank has in terms of managing this situation. So this is in terms of the sequencing, the DDO followed by the ERD, the percentage, you have some levers to play with, and it's a fairly complex negotiation because now you are negotiating with so many stakeholders. So we have to bear that in mind. Finally, a couple of other points in the restructuring of the T-bonds. Now, just to give you a sense, now this is how the T-bonds are about 8.7 trillion as at 2022, right? It hasn't changed a lot because everybody's been buying T-bills, okay? Because they think T-bills will not get affected so the concentration has increased on the T-bill side. But essentially, the largest single holder is the funds, right? So what I said earlier was the total T bond position is 24 billion. Out of that, 42% is or 43% is held by the EPF as a single largest. Then you have the state banks and the privately owned commercial banks and the savings bank. So that's the concentration. So the question is, how much of a burden should be passed to the financial services sector, and who should bear that cost, bear that burden? Of course, there can be the why, but I think we are at this point about, we want to, the economy needs to move forward, we need to move beyond the DDR, and we should do it fairly rapidly so we can put the country back on a growth. I have a couple of more slides, and then we can hopefully move. So a few things that I want to highlight again and sort of revisit. One of it is that the primary balance is crucial. So what the government is doing sufficient? What the government is doing is sufficient? Whether they're looking at it hard enough, and the 2.3% of GDP positive primary balance can be achieved. That's very important, because just the debt restructuring will not put us. Otherwise, we'll have to cut a lot more deeper into the debt. Second one is the SOE restructuring. So that has started. Now, as a policy, the IMF does not put any proceeds from SOE restructuring into the DSA, because they are very conservative. The probability of them finishing is quite low. I mentioned the 3.5 billion number as the T-bond exposure level, right? So if you look at the actual announced SOE restructuring, there are multiple assets. 4 of them the SRU is trying to progress at the moment. Those proceeds can be allocated somewhere. So those are net pluses, right? One of the things is that whoever is taking the hit on the T-bonds should be allocated those top-ups. So because at the moment it is not in the government budget, right? As far as the DSA goes, the expenditure and the revenue. So if there is a restructuring, and let us say, whoever has decided to take a haircut, then, so that's one way of helping them catch up. The other way is, one of the parliamentarians also mentioned recently, is a outperformance. If we outperform on the primary deficit, then we can share the benefits back to to some element. So I think there is aspects to think of that and say that, look, because the quantum is quite sizable and the relief can be very material. For example, if particularly the funds are thought of in that way. Then, of course, there are other agencies, and this is a thing that we have seen in other countries, the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the IDA, and several other global institutions who have tried to, from the G20 economies, try to provide some relief. We should also investigate whether they can provide some assistance, particularly with regards to the reprofiling. And my final slide is really on the banking sector, right? So we should keep in mind that this is a sovereign debt, sovereign crisis. The sovereign it's a sovereign default that led to a sovereign crisis, that led to an economic crisis, and we don't want it to become a banking crisis. Banking crises are very notorious and very difficult to recover from because it's all very widespread. When you talk about a sovereign, the exposure is captured. We talked about where the exposure is. It's very contained. It's not spread out immensely. So it's quite important that it doesn't convert into a banking crisis, right? So we have seen in some places, because of the nexus between the sovereign and the banks, and this is because the banks have lent to the government, it sometimes drags the banks also down. So also, if you keep in context the 2.3% primary surplus that we are aiming for, the stability and the health of the banking system is crucial. So a few things here. One is, we need to look at, and fair play is a key part of this. We should look at what are the impacts going through the system. As far as the banks go, the banks will get hit anyway on the face value reduction on the ISP side. There'll be a significant hit. Then, of course, the banking community, as we all know, have supported the corporates here with long moratoriums, multiple moratoriums. So and the capital levels, I had a slide earlier, the capital buffers have already depleted quite a bit. So there's a thin buffer left. So that's something to keep in mind. Second one is the liquidity aspects. So when you reprofile, the cash flows get affected. And depending on the nature of the balance sheet, that can put a significant strain. And the most important thing, and Dominda here might help us clarify a little bit, is the day one impact, which is quite crucial. The recognition, the derecognition of the assets, if there's a reprofiling, can have significant day one impact. So any possibility of trying to do that without some central bank forbearance, and that can come in the form of capital reductions, in the form of delayed recognition of the restructured losses, new capital injections, as always talk. Now the new capital injection is a key point. The domestics, the capacity in the domestic system to support a recapitalization is very limited, and then we have already seen that firsthand, right? So then the capacity of the state to support it. There is some provision within the IMF for a financial stability fund. So there has been a recent asset quality review. So maybe subsequent to that, we will hear a little bit more on that. So that's my concluding comments. Thank you very much for a very patient hearing, and hopefully that was helpful for everyone. Thank you.
I will now invite Dilshan Rodrigo, Dominda Hulangamua, and Bingumal Tevaratantri to be seated, and Dilshan will take us through the key objectives of today's session. Just to pull a word from the hat I hold in sustainability, we want a just transition. A just transition in a green economy sense is how we take the economy, people, and everyone in the ecosystem without leaving anyone behind. So whether it's the environment, health, jobs, economic assets, and any losses to be fairly compensated. So the bankers here today will speak to you, and Dilshan, I invite you to the lectern, or you can probably take the objectives from there since you're comfortably seated. Yes, so I think the comfortableness in the room is now under control, and it is well set. So I hope you are well on your way to have a wonderful listening to some great inputs from these experts. Thank you.
A very good evening to all of you. Just want to start off by thanking Shahan for an extremely comprehensive presentation. I think I'd like all of you to give him a hand. So he ended the presentation by saying, we have just been through a sovereign crisis, and what we don't want to have is a banking crisis. Right? That was his last sentence. So DDR is not a good thing, right? So we'll be all happy if we can only restructure our external debt to the ISP holders, creditors, and then do away with DDR. That would be the ideal situation. We all know as bankers how businesses are hurting, and protecting the banks to be able to continue to support businesses to revive is a key consideration for all of us. So this session, the objectives of this session is, as you know, the topic, demystifying DDR, right? So what does that mean? It means that you should be able to go home today in the evening and explain to your mother, who is not a financial person, in simple terms what DDR means, or explain to your 12-year-old daughter what DDR means and what DDO means and what are the implications of that, right? So that's the responsibility on all of us. So there's a lot of terminology involved in this. There is DDR, DDO, there is the gross financing need, debt sustainability, regulatory forbearance, lots of terminology, right? And some of those were already covered in the keynote presentation. So the first is, what is this about? Second is, why is it necessary? Third is, what forms it can take, and Shahan explained the three different types of DDR that can take place, the coupon adjustment, the maturity extension, and the what was the third?
Haircut.
The haircut, right? So, and then the next one also he covered in terms of the scenarios and the important timelines and the impacts to the various stakeholders of this, if it has to happen, right? We don't want it to happen, but if it has to happen, what would be the implication on the banks, what would be the implication on the pension funds, what would be the implication on EPF, insurance companies, and most importantly, for the general public at large, right? The vulnerable segments of the population. And then finally, what to expect post restructuring, right? So we are in the process of finalizing external debt restructuring as well as potentially a DDR. So what to expect for the economy after this is done? What is going to be the economic growth? What is inflation, interest rates, exchange rates? We are speculating, but that is the final discussion we will be having. So these are the 5 areas we will cover. I'll start off basically addressing some questions to the panel, maybe take 20 minutes on that, and then another further 20 minutes with you. We all feel like rock stars here with the crowd here, so we are going to be overwhelmed by questions, hopefully. So let me start by maybe addressing the first question to Duminder. Duminder, so I think Shahan mentioned about the primary balance sustainability, right? And he mentioned that the fiscal balance, the primary balance, is akin to the operating profit of an institution, right? Now, in our case, our costs, that is government expenditure, excluding interest, right, is barely covered by tax. Only 70% of that cost is even covered by tax. So there is not even a gross profit, it's actually a gross loss, right? That's the situation. So if you bring in interest, then the actual coverage of the tax revenue is probably about 30 or 40% of the total expenditure. So that's how serious the situation is. But at the moment, we've had very aggressive tax reforms, right? Almost a 50% increase in tax revenue has been anticipated. My question is, how sustainable is that? Or would it result in exactly the reverse happening? Because of these significant taxes, whether there will be a much bigger shadow economy, will there be more tax evasion, would there be more individuals and businesses moving overseas? What would be the implications of that? That's the first question.
Thank you, Dilshan, and thank you, APB, for inviting me yet again for another discussion on a similar subject. First of all, I must say that when I was introduced by Shiranti, she said that I advised government on fiscal policy reform. But I must say I advised them to increase personal income tax to 36%. So I start off with that. To answer your question, Dilshan, you see it's a challenge. There are two areas that we look into. First, I will take the expenditure side because I think that needs clarity. Because a lot of people that we meet, that I talk to at every forum, says that, okay, we are prepared to pay tax. Although they're not prepared, but they say at least we are prepared to pay the tax. We want to pay the tax. But the government also must be able to be transparent and accountable and also reduce government expenditure. Now, on government expenditure, there are 4 areas. First, you have public service salaries, which is about 1.2 trillion estimated for this year. Then you have another 1.2 trillion estimated for pensions, subsidies, and a purchase of goods and services. Then you have about 2.2 trillion of interest expenditure. And capital expenditure, it can be zero, or there's estimated to be about 1.5 trillion next year. Now, of these 4 elements, salaries and subsidies are not discretionary spending. Unfortunately, government has no discretion to cut down salaries overnight. All the other people are saying let's go to public service, the military is too big. All that may be true or not, but you can't cut down public servants overnight in terms of numbers and salaries, because that will lead to civil unrest, and the program can't be carried through. So it is a medium-term strategy to reduce government expenditure in terms of salaries, whether it's project council, inter-government or military. So it's a 3 to 4 year program where you can not recruit people for the places people are retiring. So that's one strategy. Secondly, subsidies, pensions also can't be cut overnight. If you like it or not, it will continue. So 2.4 to 2.5 trillion rupees, there's no discretionary or discretion for the government to take. Interest, 2.2 trillion as Saharans mentioned in his presentation. Of that, how much relief we are going to get in the debt refinancing is a question. Whether we can afford 2.2 trillion or whether it will be 1 trillion is an issue. We need to cut that. And the only discretionary pending government has therefore is capital expenditure. But if you cut capital expenditure beyond a certain limit, there is no growth, there's no development. So actually, in my view, on the expenditure side, there's very little room the government can play around with. Although people are saying expenditure is too high. It is very little room the government has in terms of expenditure control. The biggest relief they can get is on the interest of 2.2 trillion on the, if you, the coupons adjusted, if the rates are adjusted, if there's a postponement, deferment, then they can get a gross financing need extended in the form of a reduction in interest. So on the revenue side is the only way the government can increase. But that again, it has limitations. We have income tax at 36%. I don't think we can raise it beyond that point. It will be law of diminishing returns. Corporate income tax has 30%. My proposal to government was to increase corporate to 35% and reduce individuals to 30%. Was my proposal to government. Right? By that time, the negotiations are concluded, but I said you take corporate 35% with all the CEOs, don't mind paying tax to the corporate, but not for them personally. Right? So therefore, do it the reverse. But unfortunately, by that time, the decision was taken. And of course, the president said they look at it in the next round. So long as total revenue doesn't come down. The VAT can't be adjusted because it lost inflation. It's the highest of 15%. So the only way revenue can be increased is through greater compliance and through growth in economy. So sustainability for you, the primary deficit, in my view, 2.5%, a very optimistic target. Both Bingu and I, at Ceylon Chamber, we meet all the people, every delegation we meet. We met the IMF delegation last Thursday and we told them this 2.5 is not easy, not difficult, not easy to meet, to be flexible on it, but they are saying that's up to the government. But we have the parameters, you work with the parameters. Right? So the continuity of this depends also whether people are compliant. To answer your question, whether people default, I think people will default in any case. Right? My experience is that we gave amnesty in 2002. The same people who came with amnesty didn't declare thereafter. So Sri Lankans will not pay whether it's a 36% tax rate, a 72% tax rate, or 10% tax rate. In my view, the correction is the same. Right? I'm telling the truth. So right, we always find fault with governments and policymakers, but we also have responsibility ourselves to comply. I mean, all my corporate clients who are compliant, I'm saying it's not them, but there are people outside that. And there has to be a natural diligence for compliance, and people have to also rally around this program because in the IMF program, Saran, if you look at that document, there's one risk on macroeconomic policy, there are risks identified. One big risk they identified is the program failing. The program can fail if there's political unrest. If the political system changes, if the people get out of the streets and protest, then the program will crash. If the program crashes, this whole thing will crash. So we have no resurrection. So therefore, it is important duty upon all of us to support the program and pay the tax and take it forward. It's upon us to make sure it works. It's not upon anyone else. That's my answer.
Thank you, Demystifying. I'm going to move on to a slightly different topic, and I'm going to ask Bingu this question. So like Shahan demonstrated, there are lots of stress tests that are being done, and there is that $17 billion that has to be made up, right, in terms of the requirement. So, your opinion, what extent of DDR, if it's, unfortunately we don't want DDR, but what extent of DDR is tolerable for the banking sector? What is the right balance in your opinion? All tough questions, huh?
That's good. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Rishan. I mean, first of all, thanks for having me. If I just to give you some context, the historic numbers, the last 100 debt restructurings that we've done, we've seen globally, we've seen about 29 going into a domestic debt restructuring. 1/3 of that ended up with the banking sector crisis. Russia was a disaster in the early 2000s because they also charged the T-bills. Now, Barbados recently did a T-bill reprofiling, nothing happened. So there are these extreme examples. But looking at Sri Lankan scenario, just to touch on the presentation also, I mean, you took a lot of time explaining everything. But there are a few things that we need to understand. The interest to revenue ratio, even this year, we're looking at 3.2 trillion on interest income, and the interest is going to be 2.2 trillion, not sustainable, right? 60%. So if you look at their local debt stock about 36 billion from a dollar perspective, if you average the interest rate is about 16-17%. Next year's interest cost again is going to, if you keep it that way, going to be like close to $6 billion from a dollar perspective, and your revenue will be $9 billion, right? With the current GDP levels, again not sustainable. So from the other one is the GFN, gross financing needs, the least understood and the most complex one. And you need to meet the GFN target at 13%, gross financing needs at 13%. Just to give you a perspective, today it's 25%. So 25% going down to 13%. Out of that, local financing has to be 8.5%. And your fiscal deficit at the time will be something like 4%. So just imagine, you can only get 8.5, 4% go to fiscal. You have very little room to settle your bonds. So from that perspective, again, government will not have fiscal space to settle the bonds. Looking at the targets, from 2027 running up to 2032, you have to maintain 13% GFN. The least understood parameter is that, and the most complex one. We are still getting there. And this whole primary surplus of 2%, I'm less optimistic about it. Solely because we only done 5 times. 5 times we had a primary surplus in the last 74 years, right? So just imagine. And if you see in the first quarter tax revenues, it's gone up, but not to the target. So achieving 3.2 again this year, 3.2 trillion worth of tax revenues, even for this year, will be very challenging. By looking at all of that, bringing the interest cost down would be critical for the country. Now the banking sector. So the banking sector, when you look at some of these examples, very difficult to give you an exact answer in terms of what would work for the banking sector. What we are trying to say is, if you impact the banking sector beyond a point, we won't be able to play a role in terms of economic revival. Now IMF has predicted 2.7 to 3% growth for the next 6-7 years. We believe Sri Lanka can do much more than that. Now the other challenge is, when you have these low growth targets, it puts a lot of pressure on the creditors. But coming back to the banking sector participation, we can get together and grow this economy at 4-5% in 3-4 years, right? Much above the IMF targets, but we have to be strong. So if you look at a, T-bond, especially, let's take the T-bills aside, because now there's very clear guidance on that. Again, if you postpone this problem by 3-4 months, we might have to do the T-bills as well, because now you're ballooning the problem by postponing this DDO. We say that's out for the moment. I think that's a clear guideline on that. So if you look at the T-bonds, the real challenge is banking sector has, like you correctly said, there are challenges after coming out of COVID. We have a lot of bad debts. Now the NPAs are hovering around 12.4%. We believe we have not hit the bottom yet. We might go to a 13-14%. The SME NPAs in some banks must be about 18%. So that's where we are. So already there's stress on the capital. But the capital ratios are, as an average, it's about 15%, but not enough to weather this storm. So if you have a day one impact, now it all depends on the kind of restructuring that they do. If there's a day one impact, even if you reprofile, right, no haircuts on the capital, you reprofile and take a coupon cut. That's the most probable, thing that can happen. Looking at the GFN targets and all of that, there'll be a day one impact for the banks. So getting that day one impact amortized would be critical for us. Then the other thing is, some amount of regulatory forbearance on the capital ratios would be critical for us. More than anything, the banking sector stability fund will be critical, because there can be a liquidity stress coming into the banking sector. The challenge is, even if a small bank goes down, there'll be a domino effect in a small market like Sri Lanka. It won't be like Silicon Valley scenario. It will be very different in a markets like Sri Lanka, and we've seen that happening in some of the South American markets. So shape and form of it, I think we should not speculate. Participation, we might have to, it says voluntary. Now, the other thing is, if it's voluntary, we might not participate. right? Why do you want to participate? Why do you want to take a haircut and all of that, right? I'm very selfish talking about the industry or a particular bank, right? Why should I, as an individual investor, I will not participate if it's voluntary, right?
So your answer is zero.
No, I mean, if you ask the question, nobody will participate. But we have seen, looking at again the historic data, the recent Ghana example, there's a carrot and stick approach. Now, Jamaica had a banking sector stability fund. They said, if you participate, you can access the stability fund. That was a carrot. Now, Ghana, what they did was they said voluntary, and the last moment they said, if you hold on to the old bonds, you will have to take 100% capital charge. So immediately, including Standard Chartered, jumped and we had to participate in the restructuring, right? I mean, we were forced to participate, and they got probably 85% participation. And there's more to do on the local debt restructuring, but they are slowly getting it right. You can now see Ghana moving on with the restructuring, and they just got money from IMF, so they are progressing. So the larger issue is for the country getting the debt restructuring done would be critical, because if you don't get the DDO done, you can't go into the next level, external debt restructuring. The bondholders will, what have you done for the local debts? The other problem that for us to understand is Sri Lanka's problem is not a BOP crisis. Now you can see the rupee appreciating, more dollars in the market. It came up as a BOP crisis, but it's a larger fiscal crisis. 70 years of living on the edge, borrowed money, subsidies everywhere. We all got free education, free health. Sometimes we forget, people say, I don't want to pay taxes because I don't get anything, but I'm sure 90% of us, more than 90% of us have gone to state schools or private, semi-private schools. So we've already benefited from the social welfare, this whole welfare state. So it's a larger fiscal issue that we have to sort out. Interest cost has to come down. I'm sure banks will participate if there's a process. And again, on the AQR, so there's 5 banks have gone into asset quality review, the domestically important banks. There's another 4 banks joining that. I think HNB also had discussions to some of the state banks. So why they're doing that is, one, to understand the real LI situation because of the current bad book. Plus, if there's a potential DDO, if you participate, what would be the impact of the capital and all of that. So I'm sure multilaterals have given this, it's in the public domain as well. They're committed on a stability fund. So there'll be some amount of money coming into a stability fund. Why this whole thing getting postponed is also to get it right. So I'm sure there are multiple conversations happening, and the plans are in place. It'll be published anytime soon. And at that time, we'll see how we will participate. The parameters, I don't want to speculate at this point.
To paraphrase what you're saying is as low as possible. We just cannot afford a too high TDR or DDO, because the banking sector will get hurt in the process, right? So it will
So
they
ability
ultimately
to,
affect the
so
business.
the capital
so
comes
we need to
down.
keep it as low as possible.
Yeah, we are, as a community, we are pushing, but we also should not be seen as crony capitalists, right? So we should think about the country first. Country comes first, and banking sector is important to revive the economy. That's how I look at it.
Sure.
So we are fighting for the sector because we will play a key role.
Right.
But one thing for the promoters of the sector also, I know we don't have deep pockets these days, and the borrowing costs are very high, but when time to come, once the capital augmentation plans are given, they'll have to come to the party. They'll have to either come or divest and give it to a better investor who can manage the sector. So everybody has to participate.
So just taking a cue from what Bingu just mentioned about the big problem the country has is the fiscal, less so than the balance of payments, right? So in order to address the fiscal issue, there are a number of aspects that need to be addressed. One is the corruption, the efficiencies in the SOEs, all that smaller government, all that needs to come through, right? So my question to Shahan is, how do you feel the digitalization drive? How important is this digitalization drive in achieving those goals?
I suppose at the moment there is a much larger problem we are kind of dealing with, but we need to keep in context that this is a journey. The banks here, we are 100, 200 years old, long history, and we are building banks for 100 years more, 200 years more. Right, so in that journey, to be not left behind, digitalization is core. Now, within the various banks, within the various board tech committees, within the various procurement committees, there is constraint. Bingu spoke about having deep pockets, and of course you need money to spend on IT to promote the digitalization. The digitalization is very crucial to bring down costs. I mean, if I can put it that way, cost savings also on the government side. Devinder talked about non-payment of taxes. We've seen in certain neighboring markets, they have very successfully rolled out digitalization programs. So this is a crucial element. So we do have to do whatever we can to continue the digital spend and continue on the digital journey so we don't get left behind from global financial institutions while we grapple with so a lot of battles to fight at the same time. But the digital one is also a key focus we shouldn't lose.
Especially when it comes to the transparency of sending money to the vulnerable segments directly. So if you have the digital ID, there is no intermediary when you send all these welfare payments. It goes directly to the beneficiary. And there is so much efficiencies that can come through that process and cut out a lot of intermediaries unnecessarily. That increases those costs and also improves the transparency also with the funding bodies. And they also then recognize that there is a very effective process. So that's really sending the money straight to the vulnerable segments. Maybe the final question, maybe to Bingu, before we open it out to the audience, would be that this is a contentious question. The first quarter results out, right? And there is a view, and I've heard this in some TV programs also, where people are saying, look, banks are still making a lot of money, their staff are getting big bonuses, but we as businessmen are continuing to suffer, right? How do you address that question?
The first thing is the sector profitability has come down by 40%. That's something that we have to acknowledge. That's a problem. Second thing, the ROTs or the ROEs of the banking sector has come down to almost single digit, just about 10%. An emerging market banking sector should deliver minimum 18%, 15 to 18%. Even OECD banks are delivering 14, 15%. Right? That's the target set. Just imagine a market like us, we're delivering 10%. So getting investors in a scenario like that would be very difficult. So people should not worry too much about when banks make money, because when banks make money, it goes back to the capital and we reinvest, and that's the way it works. Coming back to the bonuses and all of that, again, I heard this question in another panel discussion also. See, I don't know if you all know, Sri Lankan banking sector is heavily underpaid in my view. Heavily underpaid, right? Right. So I'm comparing with markets like Zimbabwe.
Bankers, so
No, I've managed some of those countries. I've seen the payroll of Tanzania. I've worked there. I worked in Mauritius. I've seen at least 5-6 African markets, including Zimbabwe. So probably 5-6 years ago we were okay, but the salaries have not gone up compared to some other industry, like even take apparel, even take tech. One problem we have is banks have a lot of staff. I don't know how many people we have, maybe 50,000 people in industry. We have a lot of staff, so even if you increase by 5%, there's a huge cost to the bank. So banks have to be lean. If you want to pay a global salary, you have to be lean. It's very important. Sadly, local banks are not lean, so because of the way we are designed. But coming back to the salary thing, I think we have to look after the bankers, because I think there are thousands of people migrating as we speak. They don't see a future. Good old days, we joined the bank because there were housing loans at 5% and car loans at 3%, and you had a decent lifestyle. After 10 years, you have a car. After 10-15 years, you definitely have a house as a banker. But today, all our housing loan schemes are obsolete. Right? What can you build from those, 10 million, 5 million? I don't know who gives 10 million these days, but those loans are not enough, sadly. And the salaries are also, with the tax structure we have, not enough for the executives to progress. So I am of the view that Sri Lankan banking sector can do a lot, because inflation is still at 35%. Last year average was very high. This year still average is about 22%. I don't think we have adjusted the salaries for that. And taxes have also gone up. So disposable income is very low. Overall banking sector salaries, I think my sentiment is low in Sri Lanka.
Thanks, Bingu. You have been patiently hearing our discussion here in the panel. How about hearing from you? What kind of thoughts you have, any questions you have that you would like to address to the panelists?
A quick question to Sharan about the scenarios that was presented. The scenario, has it taken into account any of the macro geopolitical or economic situations in the US or in Europe or anything like that when we are looking at our own DDR? Is that being taken into account, or what are your thoughts on that?
It's a very good question. Thank you. So, particularly the transmission through the exchange rate, and it's when we make these forecasts, it's very difficult to put too much variability onto those. So generally, you tend to hold those fairly constant or with some nominal trend. So, for example, if when we do inflation in this country, we used to use an average of 5% to 8%. So you have that trend driven. So the performance of the US dollar against the euro, other currencies against the rupee, we have seen so much volatility that it's not easy to model it. But to answer your question directly, there hasn't been so much debate into that. Particularly the India-China relationships, how that might affect our FDI flows or trade flows. You take an assumption that there is some impact, but then it evens out over a period of time. That's how you treat it. But there hasn't been any debate for me to be able to sort of share with you a bit more detail.
Thanks. Can I pose a question to the three eminent bankers on the panel? I'll excuse my former colleague from the chamber out of this, but my question to you is that, okay, if you all feel that DDR, if you come to the realization that DDR is unavoidable and without that, the country can't move forward, right? So if the country can't move forward, obviously the banking sector can't go forward as well. So if you are at that point, right, why not the banks come together, right, and come up with a package? I mean, what do you think is the best deal, right? And say, okay, this is what we can bear. And then at the same time, you tell them, okay, if you have to do this, this is what the government has to do. Because obviously some accommodation has to take place in terms of the accounting standards, right? I mean, if you're worried about the first day one loss, how that's going to be dealt with, as well as the capital aspect, so some kind of regulatory forbearance has to come into play, right? So if you take the initiative and say, okay, this is what we can do and this is what we want you to do, won't that be better than sort of waiting for government or somebody else to come up with their own proposal?
Maybe I'll start off on it. I think such proposals are being made, and I think what is clear is that the depth of if you take it into perspective, the depth of the restructuring does not necessarily require the banks to take it. If the banks are not taking it, somebody else has to take it. So the decision on who bears the burden is the question. Now, if the cut is so deep that everybody necessarily has to take it, that is not the case here. So the numbers don't point towards if the restructuring was, let's say, instead of 17 was 27, we had another 10 billion we needed, then I think the question would be very, very immediate. Now, if the guidance is given that you have to do something and come up with, and this is the minimum allocation, you come up, now that's what the IMF has done. So you have to achieve this target. You tell us how you're going to do it. And it's up to you to deliver the target. Now, the path to delivering the target is, at the discretion of the government of Sri Lanka. That's how they structure it. So there is the opportunity for the government to take a view like that. But, and I think Bingu can also add to this, but I think the number is such that there is some flexibility in terms of where it's allocated. Now, I think people shouldn't think of this as what can the banking sector take. This is a very important point, right? What does it mean when you say what can the banking sector say? It means what's the capital impact? That's it. So what does that really mean? Lending growth. That's it. So it's not, the bank, we are fiduciary responsibility for other people's money. Right? So if you pass the burden on to the banking sector, it just means that there is a capital liquidity impact, which just means that space is no longer available for credit growth. So if the government takes the view that space is no longer needed for credit growth, then they can take it. But if you put the capital down from, and I think the tier 1 may be more pertinent, from let us say 11-12% tier 1 down to 8-9, and the banks decide, under the rules we can't lend anymore, Now, what does that mean in terms of the primary balance and the GDP growth, which then links back? So that is the question. So it is not the bankers' money, right? It is the capacity of the banks to support growth that gets affected. It's a really important, I think, perspective of it.
If I can just add my comments also. So there are multiple scenarios. I mean, almost on a weekly basis, monthly basis, we send scenarios to the central bank in terms of what would happen if this scenario were to happen in terms of ISB restructuring and on DDR. And then on each of those scenarios, I'm sure they are collating it for the entire industry and working out what would be the impact, right? But as Shahan mentioned, the important thing is there is some flexibility in terms of capital buffers. So within those buffers are there to release it in a time of distress. So we can release it and then take that, right? So if some of our banks have, let's say, 14% in tier 1, then up to 12% for the industry, maybe we can manage by releasing some of the buffers. But that is it. If we go below that threshold and say 8-9%, just as an example, then you're asking for recapitalization. Who is going to recapitalize? Private sector banks, shareholders are not going to come and recapitalize. Right? It's not easy to find other commercial investors to come and want to recapitalize because it will take time. And in between that time, there can be a lot of distress that is caused. Then again, you have to go back to the multilaterals like the government is doing and say, help us, which is also going to take time. Right? So it's very important that, we are sustainable to be able to help the others. Right? If the banking sector is a cow, if the cow is ill, then there is no milk to give to anybody. So we have to make sure that we work within those parameters of what is tolerable amount within that capital buffer. If you go beyond that, then we have to go back and say, look, we can't lend, we need help to get our capital back on track. So there is, even within that buffer, there is something called regulatory forbearance, right? So within a period of 5 years, we can manage to, take that hit into our profits. And again, that's a tolerable level of hit. Right, so for the industry, maybe a certain amount of, we say, 50% of our profits we can allocate for that. But if it goes beyond that and the banks are going to make losses because it's so hard, then the whole purpose is lost. So that's the point. Ming, you want to add something?
It's very difficult to go to the government and say, as an industry, here's the haircut we are going to take or reprofiling. Because we also, as individual banks, I'll be very honest, we have diverse portfolios, diverse interests. Some got more ISB, some got more local debt, some got more T-bills, some got zero T-bonds. So we're different from that perspective. But as a SLBA, we've gone and said, if you do X, Y, and Z, this will be the impact. So be careful before you do it. That we have lobbied very well. We also said certain things like we were engaged the CE organization to see if there's a day one impact, what can happen. So regulatory forbearance had been a discussion right throughout. There is a conversation on stability fund. We don't know the size of it, shape and form of it, how to approach, we don't know. So as an industry, we have said if you hurt the banking sector beyond a point, we won't be able to participate in the recovery process. That's what we've said. Even with the regulatory forbearance, it's not okay to say okay sometimes, You get what I mean? So, no, it's a very, very good question, Manjula. So as a community, we are working together. But we also didn't have enough information at a particular time. That's why we also had to send a press release, and then central bank approached us and gave us some amount of assurance saying sector will be stable. But shape and form of the DDO, we don't know yet. But I'm sure it will come out soon. So, yeah.
Now, we were talking about the impact on our capital as banks and our profitability and all that. But public at largely worry about their deposits. Day one, what can we say to the depositors? Would there be impact on the depositors?
I'll start off the question. Maybe the other bankers can add to that. So again, it depends on the size of the haircut, right? So if we are to get into, it's again, what is this tolerable amount of DDR that we are talking about, right? So if it is going to be, extreme situation, right? 40% of our balance sheets are in government securities at the moment, right? If in a worse scenario, they say, look, 30% of that is going to be haircutted, right? Or there is going to be a maturity extension. You wipe out your capital, right? So then how are we going to manage? Then obviously it's going to impact depositors, right? So we don't want to look at that kind of, envisage that kind of situation, right? So ultimately it's about trying to manage within that tolerable level of capital. That's what the bankers are working on, so that ultimately we are trying to tell the foreign debt holders, look, you have to help the banking sector to be stable so that we can help in terms of ensuring that the businesses are sustainable, the domestic fiscal position improves, right, which gives the confidence for you all to come back and lend to us again. Otherwise it's going to become more and more difficult as time goes by.
No, I mean, by looking at, I mean, with the discussions we've had, and central bank also has given us that assurance that, you know, there'll be some level of comfort support when they do this. So I don't think depositors have to worry unless there's a capital haircut and a major capital erosion, you know, and they run out of cash. There can be liquidity challenge. Now Lebanon has gone through this because they didn't go to IMF. They completely neglected the whole default. They've not gone to IMF yet. So Lebanon had very different challenges. We should not compare ourselves with Lebanon, because what we have done, if you compare the last two examples, Suriname and Zambia, we got a much better, you know, business case. We've gone to IMF, done the staff level, got the EFF in 6 months. Now we are doing the DDO, hopefully the external debt restructuring in a couple of months. And we believe if we play our cards right by September, October, we can come out of this. And I say come out of this, at least come out of the default rating. That's the starting point. You will not get an investment, you know, you will not get a high big rating upgrade, but some upgrade. That is critical for us to start the trade business, LC confirmations, revive the economy. So I don't think depositors have to worry.
I would totally sort of agree with that. When we look at the restructuring stages and where we are not anywhere near that. And none of the central bank communication, IMF communication, have we discussed that. So we have actually improved from what we thought. Initially, there were discussions, if you take it before the DSA, there were talks of possible haircuts on the T bonds, government security. We are not talking about haircuts on the government bond portfolio anymore. We are only talking about maturity, extension and coupon cuts. So you have to cross that threshold before you touch the depositors. Because the worst thing is, once you touch the depositors, you now cut into the bone. You're in very dangerous territory, and actually there's no need for us to think about that, because before they talk about that, they have to talk about a haircut on the bonds. Now they have also been able to insulate the T-bills in their DSA scenario. So you can't cherry pick the nice parts of one scenario and pair it with the nice parts of another scenario. That's why you have to look at the holistic picture. But the scenario, workable scenario we have, with some ambition on maybe the primary balance, is this scenario in which we only take a reprofiling and a coupon.
Maybe just to add to that, I mean, if you look at the balance of payments, like we mentioned earlier, there are significant improvements already being evident, right? So exports minus imports, we've seen significant, with all the decisions that were taken on contracting imports, there's a lot of work that has happened there. So current account is now much more stable than what it was. Then on top of that, tourism income is improving. Remittances are improving significantly. So all that means is that another further 10% increase in any of those elements will help us to be able to even become sustainable in terms of servicing our foreign debt, interest and capital. So that is less of a problem. The issue is really on the fiscal side, right? So I think with all the measures that have been taken over the last couple of years, there have been significant improvements that is evident on the balance of payment side. So that means our dollar debt can probably be able to be serviced from our own sources of dollar income without having to put pressure on us having to, you know, issue treasury bills and bonds and convert it into dollars to be able to settle the overseas income, which means the rupee can strengthen. And that's what you're beginning to see right now. Rupee is strengthening, right? So if we can get, now we started off saying we have a twin deficit problem. We have a balance of payments problem and a fiscal problem. Now hopefully with a little bit more effort, it will be only one problem, which is the fiscal problem, which will take a little bit of time to achieve. But if we can at least get the other part on a sound footing and be able to service our debt also in dollar denominated debt from that same income, then the situation becomes much more healthier because the rupee gets stronger, and that is a virtuous cycle that builds in.
Well, during the last year, the treasury bills rates have been around 30% interest per year. But if you look at the EPF, the members' EPF fund, the EPF members, I think perhaps their money is also deposited in these treasury bills or whatever. They have been paid only 9%, which I think is very unfair. How could anybody pay such a low interest when the going rate is about 30%? And also, could I know will there be any impact on the EPF fund of individuals in these circumstances?
I'm not familiar with the return profile given to the EPF. I think there is a fundamental, from the limited knowledge I have, there's a fundamental weakness in the guaranteed return, which is set at too lower threshold. So there is a structural element there, and I think it's set at 2.5% or something like that, which was set a long time ago. So I can't answer the first part of your question, but maybe Dilshan or Ming can add to that. I think it is a question of return, not a question of haircut. So what we are talking about is not a capital reduction as far as anybody's T-bonds go. So how the government will allocate between the various creditor groups is not yet stated, and that is the point of discussion, I think, currently ongoing. But for any creditor group affected, it will not be on the capital, it will be on the interest. Now, as you were saying, you were having a lower than market return. So it is possible that the T-bonds that were offered, and this is just market chatter, the T-bonds that were offered to the state banks were at various numbers are quoted, 10 or 11%, with a 5-year maturity extension. So again, those are not sort of numbers that are publicly available, and there is just general discussion around that. So it may affect the return rather than the capital. So I think that's what I can comment on that.
First part I am also not sure, but looking at the interest rate scenario, and if there's a coupon cut, still you come down to 10-11%, I think you should be okay. This 30% interest is something that we never planned for, and it won't be there for a long time. So yeah, so your capital, and you will get some amount of interest. So I don't think the provident fund holders should worry too much about it.
Once again, a question to the panel. I think we are trying to debate on one angle whether to take a one-off cut or whether to go for a fiscal type of a reform. What about if we look at from the banking sector proposal, if you look at a combination of both instead of trying to identify one of them? For example, as the provisions are made to take perhaps a hit up to the level the provisions are made, and on the other hand, to support the fiscal angle, to give a proposal where, okay, if we make profits, the banking sector, a higher amount will be provided as taxation, for example, 1/3 of the profits is, or even a higher amount. So over a longer period of time, while achieving the stability of the banking sector, it contributes towards the fiscal issue as well, but at the same time not taking an immediate cut through the formula suggested for recognition purposes. Then I'm sure a dialogue can be entertained with the central bank to amortize it over a longer period of time, and the public perception will improve. With larger profits, the banking sector is contributing towards to settlement of the issue as well. What about your opinion?
So there was a two-part question, right? I don't think the government now. The banks will take a haircut on the ISPs. I think that is sort of the direction it's going at, and that's the central bank. So there is a haircut one-off. So whether the international creditors will be happy to treat the local ISP holders separately from the international ISP holders, I think that's going to be very challenging. They will say preferential treatment if you're domestic, but that is something that I think they may explore. On the local side, there is no one-off hit, right? So there is a maturity extension and a coupon cut. There is a day one recognition, but that is the one that the accountants and the bankers are now working through, trying to figure out whether there is a bit of forbearance. So That I think they will come to some understanding, and there is some leeway on both sides to figure out what that is. The profit share now, of course, I don't know, Bing, is it 50%? That what's the effective?
It's huge, yeah, close to 50. Yeah.
Currently, about
already it's very high.
So 50% effective tax rate. So of course, if you make more, you're sharing more. Whether that should go up to 75%, we can ask Bingu to comment.
No, not enough space. Even now, not enough space. Banks are actually beefing up capital at 50%. If you look at the emerging markets, we are one of the highest tax rated industries. Sri Lankan banking industry, not healthy. The larger challenge is how do you bring down the interest cost in the next 2 years? So that you can't do by agreeing to pay later. You have to bring the interest cost down. That's the most important thing. And I don't think banks can agree to anything more than what we are paying now. It's very important that the balance we make, we have to capitalize, because our LIs, apart from all these ISBs and SLDVs, T-bonds and all of that, we have a large NPL portfolio and it's going up. So we need more capital to manage that, and we need to make profits. We have to be in profit.
Yeah, no, that's a very important point. At the end of the day, impairments have shot up, and impairments are a function of businesses. Businesses not doing well, particularly SMEs, right? The lifeblood of the economy. So if they don't revive, then ultimately the knock-on impact is on all of us anyway. So that has to be the foremost consideration. So profits aside, it's important that we ensure businesses are sustainable. And today we are in a situation where a lot of businesses got moratoriums, debt moratoriums until December, right? If you take HNB's example, as much as maybe 5% of our total SME and corporate base were on moratoriums, debt moratoriums in December. And many of them are still struggling to revive, right? So although we sort of told them like from January onwards start paying, that 5% is quite significant in terms of the impacts on the bottom line. If they don't revive and are unable to even service the interest. So that's a challenge. So I think profits is not the big consideration right now. I think for the next 4 or 5 years, we need to be able to ensure that the banks are sustainable, and the more important than for that is to ensure that businesses at large are able to manage, right? And if that doesn't happen, then you'll have, it will be, people will not want to, be able to do business here. And once that mindset comes in, then it's very difficult to turn it around.
This is also an open question to the panel. There is a lot of uncertainty with the DDR, and so we haven't seen the interest rates going anywhere. No, they are still very high. But the expectation is once you get some more clarity on DDR and the inflation also coming under control, the interest rates will come down. There will be sharp adjustment in the interest rate and the yield curve. So that will have a positive impact on the government finances and the gross financing needs as well. So has that been factored or in the projections in IMF, with DDR and, more clarity on that aspect, bringing the yield curve down and, that help in the future gross financing needs? Has that scenario been factored in any of the scenarios?
Yes, very much. And some people might say again the assumption is too aggressive. So the drop in real interest rates is something that they are counting on. So you can also see that maybe we see inflation dropping, interest rates took a slight pause, but the expectation of the central bank and the IMF is for it to drop sharply. So I think that's...
Yeah, one thing I would like to add is IMF is forecasting a very low growth. That puts a lot of pressure on the creditors, including the local creditors as well as the offshore. So I've had discussions on this one. What they're saying is they don't want any, surprises. So they have forecasted low. I think we can do much better than that. We might not see some of these problems that we're talking about now. In 2 years, like Dilshan said, it will completely disappear. But for some reason, they are forecasting low because there can be an event risk, there can be a political risk. So those issues are there. Coming back to your point, you're spot on. With the DDO, rates will come down. That will start the economic revival. So we might grow faster than we expect. Yeah.
So a good DDR, right? Something that we all are comfortable with, and the banking industry can actually reduce interest rates, stimulate economic growth much beyond the levels that IMF is projecting 1.5% for this year, 3% for next year. We can do much, much better. So that's the message that we want to send out to the overseas creators to say help Sri Lanka to become sustainable so that we can continue to come and access funds going forward. Otherwise, if there is a instability in the banking sector, then all these things cannot work. So it's a virtuous cycle that we need to work on. I think in the interest of time, I think we need to now close. Is that okay, President? Yes. So we will close. Just a couple of takeaways. I think I started off by saying there are certain objectives on this session. What is this all about? What does it entail? What forms it can take? And what would be the impacts on the wider economy? I hope all those questions have been addressed and you have the confidence now to and speak to your mother about DDR and she will understand what it's all about. It was a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much for your participation and also the panelists for really being very open in terms of the conversations we had. We asked a lot of tough questions, but we got that the very reason for that was only to ensure that your understanding also improves and it also provokes you to do your own little research, where there's a lot of material on the mainstream media and social media on this area right now. So it's a very important area. At the end of the day, the entire banking landscape for the next 3 years and the country landscape is going to change because of what has just taken place. So it's very important, and I'm very happy that we have such a big group of people who've been able to participate in this session and also be able to share this message with others as well, because that knowledge is so important to all of us. I'm very happy to be a part of this panel. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you, Dilshan. I would like to ask you all to remain on stage while I invite Mr. Preena, our President, Senior Vice President of APB, Halin Hettigoda, Vice President Santan Narumugam and Dilshan Pereira, accompanied by 2 members of our Continuous Professional Development Committee, Ramanesh Gunawardena and Manjula Herath, to give away some tokens of appreciation for being such wonderful panelists. Please come on stage to hand over the tokens, and this presentation party will be followed by the vote of thanks, which will be delivered by Mr. Rohana Kumara, who is our Secretary General of APB. I also must recognize the presence of board directors, corporate management, both present and retired, and many, many bankers of all levels, union leaders and general public in the audience. Over to Rohana for the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Chiranti. So very good evening to all of you. So we have now come to the end of the very fruitful evening seminar organized by Continuous Professional Development Committee of APB. I hope that you all got very good insight into this hot topic, DDR, rather now we call DDO. So I know that you all are now in the go home mood without taking much of your valuable time. So first of all, I would like to give our sincere thanks to the Mr. Mushin, the Deputy Chairman of Commercial Bank of Ceylon PLC, and our eminent panelist, Mr. Duminda Hulangamua, partner ENY, and Mr. Bigumal Tevaratantri, the Chief Executive Officer of Standard Chartered Bank, and also our moderator today, Mr. Dilshan Rodrigo, C-Level Law, and the Executive Director of HNB for accepting our invitation and serving on this panel amidst your busy schedule. And dear members of APB, fellow bankers and participants, so your enthusiastic participation is really encouraging us for us to have many more events in the future. Thank you very much for your participation. So special thanks should go to our CPDC team headed by Chiranti Kure. So I think that this is the first event that they are organizing as in this calendar. I hope that they will continue with many more events like this. And also I am very thankful to our President, Mr. B.H. Prina, for giving valuable advices and also encouraging us to have this kind of events in this nature. And the Bank of Ceylon offered this venue and other facilities free of charge. I must give my thanks to DGM Support Service, Ms. Vijay Sekara, and also DGM HR, Mr. Dhamma Vijayawardhana, and AGM Training, Ms. Tamara, AGM Ms. Manjula, for supporting us in this event. And also, even though Mr. Nista Kasim is not here, so they are our advertising partner, not only for this event, but also for all the activities. So they are supporting us. So I am very thankful to him as well. And also this event is actually covered by our TV BOC team, Mr. Nilanga Varsuvitana and his team. So thank you very much for covering this event for the reference of our APB members in future. Thank you very much. Last but not least, our secretary at APB, Pushpa, she did a very wonderful job in organizing this event. Thank you very much for your help. So finally, I wish you all a very pleasant evening, and hopefully so we can meet again, because our CPDC team, surely they will organize many more events in this nature. Thank you very much.